I'm Bryce Futch,
I'm Spencer Amaral.
and this is The Way Forward. All right, welcome back to a new episode of The Way Forward podcast with Bryce Futch and Spencer Amaral.
Hey, Bryce.
Great to be back with you today, Spencer. Wish we could be in person, but I will enjoy sitting here on my porch enjoying this cigar while you are stuck in your office, and I will be sad for you.
I am already sad, and I'm envying you, even though I know I shouldn't. So, according to the Bible,
It's admiration, Christian admiration.
yes, I long to be with you enjoying a cigar. Hopefully next time that'll be the setting.
There it is. So as we said before, we were going to try and put out some more consistent content. Big news week. We got Tim Walz being picked as Vice President Harris's running mate, which now gives us probably the most progressive ticket the Democrats have ever had, even though there have been no primary votes cast for either of these two candidates, either now or in 2020. It's been a big week. Iran is on the verge of retaliating against Israel, and Hezbollah might get involved, and there was terrorist attacks and terrorist threats against Taylor Swift concerts, and a lot of going
Yeah.
on. But we're not going to talk about any of that. We're going to talk about some timeless American principles. We're going to be kind of sprinkling these conversations in amongst all of the other current event stuff that we may or may not decide to talk about. That's one of the best parts about having your own little podcast. You can make those calls. But
Yeah, no producer in your ear.
yes, exactly. No big brother here. We are going to talk about the Republican form of government and why it's different than a democracy and why it's better than a democracy, and some things that we should do to improve a Republican form of government. Now, Spencer, remind everyone where you went to school.
Little school in Michigan.
Well, that's like saying I went to a little school in Boston.
I'm Yeah, I went to the great Hillsdale College. Blessed to go there, and blessed to study political economy. Believe it or not, not religion. If I could go back,
Did plenty
I
of
would have
that.
triple majored in religion and philosophy and all of the
Yeah,
things,
would have been there
political
for
thought,
12 years.
journalism, jazz. But yeah, enjoyed my time there. I also, I guess what made it extra interesting for me is that I got there as a pretty rabid libertarian, and so it's not like I went in drinking all the Kool-Aid and you know
hmm
it was an uphill battle a lot of times, actively being challenged in my beliefs. But I was all about that. I wanted to be challenged. I wanted to challenge others. There was a lot of that going on, but I loved the classes, loved everything I was exposed to. One of the best parts about that education, studying political thought, is the rigor with which they want to take history on its own terms, right? Like, if we're going to talk about the founding fathers and the American political idea, then let's take it seriously. Let's read the founding fathers. Let's read the documents. Let's read their arguments for themselves and take them seriously, and not try to inject our, modern opinions or current fads
Yeah,
into the
absolutely.
conversation or interpret them through that lens. So we spend a lot of time in the Federalist Papers. We're reading the Constitution, of course, but it's even better that we have these collections, this collection of defenses written about the Constitution by several of the founders, right?
Yeah.
Which give us a great reference for why does the Constitution look this way. And to your original statement, like, we're going to talk about the Republican form of government, which is what the American system was supposed to represent. It's supposed to reflect this move away from English constitutional monarchy towards a more consistent constitutional republic. Now, I also want to say I don't view a ton of daylight between those two things, optimally speaking. The more time that's gone by, and maybe this is the Anglican in me speaking, Bryce, but the
Probably is.
more sympathetic I become with monarchy in its best form, obviously,
Sure.
right? It's too easy to see when centralized power goes wrong. But the time that we spend in scripture, the history of Israel, the kingdom of Israel, all that. Like we can go down that whole rabbit trail another time. But it's a beautiful thing when you see people gather in unity,
Yeah.
right? And build a coherent, unified society around shared values that reflect timeless truth.
Hmm.
So, optimally speaking, if you have a Christian monarchy like, you know, um, old England in
Like
the
Saul.
well, I was thinking like, the really warm, fuzzy feeling, the old movies that show like medieval England
Yeah.
and, always in like the most romantic of terms.
I'll say that's really
And
the only two versions you get of Old England is either extremely romantic or extremely dark and grayscale and no color. There is nothing else.
right. At its best, you've got minstrels singing all over the place and everyone's happy in their thatch roof cottages, right? And everyone gets along and it's awesome. It's
Right.
thoroughly Christian and there's a good king that everyone's willing to go, to hell and back for. And ideally, when all this lines up properly, it's a great picture of the kingdom of God unified behind the true king, Jesus. Now, in our world, we know people are fallen, people are messed up. This comes up in the Federalist Papers when it is said if man were an angel, we would not need laws in the first place, right?
Hmm.
If man were an angel, we wouldn't need government.
Right.
So because people are fallen, you do need government. And all of the laws the government passes are moral statements that the government is willing to send someone with a gun after you for if you
Absolutely.
violate, right? So everything about the government project is wrapped up in morality,
Hmm.
which means it's ironic that you have so many people, like my old self. I'm always preaching at myself here when I say this, but the people that say you can't legislate morality,
Well, that's
like
what
I was
legislation
saying
is.
back in my libertarian days, everything government does is legislating morality.
Right.
You're making a statement about what is just,
Hmm.
what is right, what your fellow man is has fair claim to,
Yeah.
and the government's going to back him up on that. So that is not a point of discontinuity between us and old England. The founding fathers were fighting to maintain a very robust English sense of the rights of Englishmen, and they fight a revolution to retain those rights in the fullest sense. We originally started a country framed around the Articles of Confederation, but we realized that doesn't really work because it was far too decentralized. You had a loose confederacy of states that were definitely autonomous. You couldn't tax the states. They could donate to the Congress,
If they felt like
but
it.
that didn't work so well. It turns out. If you ask people to donate taxes, you don't raise very many taxes. So they produced this constitution, which produces a central government. And it's not an all powerful central government. It is a very limited central government, but it is a central government nonetheless. And I think there's a lot to be said for viewing it as a type of restoration, not of a monarch, but the founding fathers were definitely trying to capitalize on the best aspects of monarchy in the same way that they're trying to capitalize on the best aspects of aristocracy.
Sure.
You see that in the Senate, the best aspects of oligarchy. You get that in the judiciary, the best aspects of democracy. You get that in citizens having a right to vote. Best aspects of a republic, where all of this is being strained through the representatives of the people. But I might be getting ahead of us, Bryce. So
No,
I'll,
that's
I'll
good.
stop there.
That's great.
And
That's just an excellent
okay,
answer to what school did you go to, because that just speaks to his his daily view of life, and I love it. The point you've thoroughly answered the point that I was getting to, but in asking that is that you have a good understanding of these things. I did not have the opportunity to go to Hillsdale. Well, that's not true. I did have the opportunity to go to Hillsdale, and I turned it down. I said no. But that's another story for another day.
in the greatest mistake of your life.
Yes. But yes, so I didn't go to Hillsdale, but I did have the opportunity. I had the opportunity to go. I turned them down. Huge mistake. I get it now. But all that to say, I was actually was contemplating going to law school as well, and I got talked out of it by a
Mm.
friend who's a law professor, So you don't, for what you want to do, you don't really need a law degree. You just need a good reading list. And so I've been checking off some of these classics of Western civilization. But interesting anecdote about the Federalist Papers. I'm a big audiobook guy, and so I attempted to listen to the Federalist Papers. It does not work. There are some books that are made for audio, and there are some that are not.
Oh, agreed.
And the Federalist Papers are not meant for audiobook. But you did hit on some of the great points I do want us to go into more. So the idea that we have this constitutional republic, right? And over time, it has been chipped away, and the republic part has continued to decrease, and the democracy part has continued to increase. And I would argue to our society's detriment. Democracy is basically rule of the mob, right? Might makes right. It's all about numbers. It's all about who can turn out the most people to vote. It's not about moral or objective truths or opportunities for people who are living in this space to actually sit down and think and reason. It's all about fundraising. It's all about shock factor. It's all about being bombastic. It's all about calling the other side the most names. It's just an absolute travesty. So let's talk about some of these pieces of our republic that have been chipped away over time. I think the first great example of this came under Woodrow Wilson, who reduced our Senate basically to a secondary form of the House. So we used to have a true bicameral legislature. The House was meant to be the voice of the people. It was local electeds that were in your neighborhoods, in your communities, people you would have gone to church with, people your kids would have gone to school with. And the Senate was there to be the voice of this of your state, right? So every state gets two senators because it's equal representation across the country. It's not meant to be majority rule. It's meant to be a balance to the majority. It's so if all of the congressmen in California wanted to, and all of the congressmen in New York State, and all of the congressmen in Texas were aligned, and they all wanted the same policies, they could push a radical agenda on the other 47 states. But the Senate, being equally represented by every state, was there to be a check and a balance to that power, right? So who was it that elected your state senator, your U.S. senator? It was your state house, right? So you know your state house members. They do live in your community. You do go to their kids go to school with their kids. You guys grocery shop in the same stores. You go to the same churches. And you could go to them and you could say, look, I don't know why this senator has approved this bill. It is horrible for our state. We should not have it. I want you to vote them out. And if you don't, I'm going to vote you out. And that was how we held those people accountable, right? And Woodrow Wilson, who, in my opinion, was the absolute worst president in the history of the United States, passed a constitutional amendment to basically get rid of all of that and institute the direct election of U.S. senators, where now everybody in the state votes for it. And I don't know if you would agree with this or not. I think this is where our partisan divide really started to take hold and really started to take root, because now you have the two main legislative bodies that have no one else's interest other than their party's interest in mind, right? Now there are a few that would say, well, I don't really care what my party thinks. I'm for the people of my state. But at the end of the day, they generally vote with their party. They vote in keeping with their party because their party holds all of the levers of power, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to rant for just a little bit longer, and I'd love to get some responses. So I apologize for being long-winded
No, you're doing great.
on this piece. But
I'm tracking with you.
this also correlates to our House representatives, right? If you're a
Hmm.
congressman, or if you're running for Congress and you say I'm going to go to D.C. and I'm going to overhaul the tax code, well, that's just not feasible. That's not the way the process works now. Now you go to DC, and you're given basically a menu card that you get to order off of for which committee do you want to be on, and the more influential the committee is, the more it's going to cost you in donations to the Republican National Committee or to the National Republican Congressional Committee, the NRCC or the RNC. And so you pay, you make your donation, so you have to raise money. You're sitting there now, you're U.S. congressman, instead of reading bills, debating bills, doing the work of a legislator, is now sitting in a cubicle cold calling, trying to raise money so they can afford to be on these committees. And then if they want to not only be on the committee but in leadership on that committee, they now have to raise extra money on top of what they've already raised to be on the committee. So it's an absolute sham. And it is incredibly frustrating for these people who I believe want to go to DC to make a difference. They want to serve their people, and they get there and they're just hamstrung by this process. It's
Some
not,
of them,
yeah, and it's not based off who is the smartest. It's based off who can raise the most money or who has the deepest pockets and can afford to pay out of their
mm,
own wealth. Um,
ideally,
yeah. So
yeah.
that we now have that in both bodies of our legislature, in the U.S. House and in the Senate. And so I just think this has been extremely detrimental to our position as a country.
Yes. On the note of history, I was thinking as you were going back and looking at the era that produced Wilson and the change in the constitutional system. First of all, the whole point of having legislatures at the state level appoint your senators for your states, it serves a very important purpose. And I'll draw the line. This reflects English constitutionalism. If you look at England, bicameral legislature, you have the House of Lords, the House of Commons. House of Commons, obvious connection to our House of Representatives. The voice of the people is represented there. The House of Lords in England represents the nobility of the country. For the United States, it might make less sense. Why would we have a connection to that approach when we don't have nobility in the same way? We don't have the same, difference between the landed wealth and the nobility in our country. Well, the reason why it was still important to the founding fathers to have the bicameral approach and have a Senate that is composed of people appointed by the state legislatures is because, well, it reflects the whole system of checks and balances, right? The system of checks and balances is a fancy way of saying that you create institutions that are somewhat existing in conflict with one another, like by their
Yes.
job
Yeah,
description.
absolutely.
And thus it is their job to go against one another from time to time, right? Tilt against one another and smooth each other's rough edges off, check the other institutions so that none of them gets overly powerful,
Oh, absolutely.
because that's bad for everyone there. So for the Senate to do that job well, they're capitalizing on the natural difference in the interests of states and the interests of the federal government. And then there's the interests of the people as a whole, right? So you have the people represented at the House level, the states represented at the Senate level, and then the national interest is represented. When the whole of Congress is assembled in D.C., and you got the president as well, speaking kind of in a central executive function for the country. But if the moment you take away that state centered influence and feedback to the federal government, and you just have another institution that reflects the voice of the people in that state, it takes away one of those key institutional building blocks that only exists to check the power of the government, of the federal government. So it might, and I know, so how did we get to that point where we were willing to let go of that in the early 1900s, 1913, I believe? I think it has a lot to do with the populism of the late 1800s that comes about kind of as a result of one party rule in the country. Anywhere you see one party rule,
Yes.
it doesn't produce a healthier society.
Correct.
It tends to actually produce corruption in the party that can kind of sit back and take it easy because they don't really have any
Mm-hmm.
competition. And that is ironically where the Republican Party found itself for the most part the next 60 years after the Civil War.
Right.
You only have a couple Democrats that get elected president in that entire span. Grover Cleveland's one of the interesting ones, and he represented a new form of the Democratic Party that was a move towards populism, right? William Jennings Bryan,
Mm-hmm.
similar. So you see this new outgrowth of populism rearing up, and so of course you have the natural move to direct election of senators in 1913. But when did we have the golden age of the Senate and the golden age of debates and the golden age of these amazing rhetoricians going at it and brilliant minds being reflected in the halls of Congress? That was before the Civil War, when you had very strong opinions right? On different sides of the aisle. You couldn't go back and, whitewash it to say that
Right.
everyone got along and there were no, conflicts, there was no division. No, there was absolutely division.
Hmm.
You could say it was super polarized, but in that time before the war, you still have this desire and impulse towards resolving our issues peaceably, civilly, through the political process. And so you have these amazing debates and amazing compromises that are engineered with Clay and all these other guys that are now legendary. Whereas who are the legends of the Senate? In our generation,
Right. There are very
who
few.
are we going to point to and be like, these are the guys that we're going to read their speeches years from now, and
I don't.
it's a whole different thing.
It is because
And
because
there's many,
each.
many reasons going on behind all that.
Right.
But I would love to see us have a higher bar for our politicians and our political leaders,
Absolutely, we should.
for what we expect of them and what we expect for the leadership.
Hmm. For sure. I think too the other part of this you talked about having these two groups that basically conflict with each other. I think it was John Adams who said that that was the purpose of it, right? That there's, Solzhenitsyn said that the line of good and evil runs down the middle of every man's heart. It's not like there's some group out there that's evil, and
Solzhenitsyn.
if we can just get rid of them, then we
Exactly.
will get rid of all the evil in the world. It's each individual, and so the founders knew this, and they wanted they wanted a place where men could pursue power, they could pursue authority, and they could, but in doing so, they checked another group of men also pursuing power and pursuing authority. And in doing so, they strengthened each institution, right? The fact that we just overturned the Chevron decision a few weeks ago shows how much of Congress's right authority they just said, no, we're going to give this to the regulatory state. We're going to give this to the unelected bureaucrats to decide how to actually put this law into place and actually regulate. And with the strength of law, right? These people who have not been elected by anyone, a lot of them being political appointments, are making decisions that could put people in jail, and that's just an absolute misuse of
Yeah.
our legislative system, right? So the whole purpose of the system was for groups to be in conflict with each other, but the conflict should not have been along party lines. It should be along institutional lines, right? The Senate
Yeah.
should be pushing against the House, and the House should be pushing against the Senate, and they both should be pushing against the executive, right? The executive today is not at all what the founders intended the executive to be, right? The presidency is way overblown. The if you just look at the State of the Union address, right, it's like a king coming up to give a speech. Like it's pomp and circumstance, and that's a relatively new thing. I think Truman was the first one to give a televised address, but it wasn't until Lyndon Johnson that it was televised in prime time, right? Like this has not always been the case. For a long period of time, it was simply a written report provided by the
Hmm.
executive to Congress. It wasn't even a speech in front of a joint session. So we've continued to pursue this power, and most of it's along party lines, and nobody is checking that power of the president. So then you have someone like President Obama who comes in and says, "Well, I have a phone and a pen, and I'm going to do what I want." And it's just an absolute misunderstanding of what that right role is supposed to be under our constitutional republic. So let's pivot a little bit. We've talked about the House, we've talked about the Senate. Let's talk about how we get the president and the dreaded electoral college that after it seems like after almost every election someone is saying we need to get rid of the electoral college. Let's talk about its purpose and why it exists and why it's a good thing for everyone. Do you want to start with that, or do you want me to kick it off?
I will start because
Yeah,
I
go
was
for
just
it.
thinking along those lines. What I was just thinking as you were saying that is that the system, as brilliant as it is, you have institutions that exist in tension with one another to check one another and hopefully guard against one another's weaknesses. The weakness in the whole design is that the power does ultimately reside in the hands of the people, the votes of the people in mass, to completely rearrange the thing
Right.
so
Yeah,
that we dismantle these institutions
term
in
limits,
the
right?
name of empowering ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
in theory. And so there is this natural impulse towards pure democracy. At least it has that guise to it. But of course, it's never really pure democracy. Pure democracy, just in terms of definitions, is literally no act of power happens without the people casting a vote on it,
It's a Stars
right?
Hollow model for any Gilmore Girls fans out there. I am
I have
not.
no clue what you're talking about.
Your wife has not required you to watch Gilmore Girls with her,
No,
oh man.
no.
So there's a running show very popular amongst females called Gilmore Girls. It follows
Okay.
the life and times of the Gilmore Girls, and they're a family of women. Anyway, they live in a small community in Vermont, I believe. It's called Stars Hollow, and they have a democratic form of government within their community, and they have these town hall meetings where the whole town gets together and votes on things, and it's very picturesque, but it's also a little dystopian, and I have some strong opinions about why
Wow.
Gilmore Girls is horrible. But we won't go into those today.
Fascinating.
But direct democracy is what I was
That
referencing.
would be real democracy. Um, Republican form of government is government through representatives. Constitutional republic is government by representatives according to a constitutional system,
Right.
a foundation that is determined. So for so many of the people that we have today talking about democracy, they don't really mean pure democracy. They mean use your votes to empower me and my government to do the things you want us to do. And that can easily become very bloated big government,
Yeah, and it's mob rule.
central government.
Absolutely.
And yeah, just like I like distinguishing between, a king by definition is good, should be good.
Right.
He's got an important job. A king is what we call a good king. What do you call a bad king? A tyrant.
Right.
Right? A dictator. Same thing with democracy. You could have a very conscientious, responsible electorate. That's the dream behind democracy or democratic republic. But what do you call a power hungry, crazed democracy? You call it a mob,
Yeah.
right? As you get in Rome back in the day. That just implodes in on itself. So we're trying to avoid that. These institutions that the founding fathers put together are meant to be checks, kind of speed bumps through the neighborhood so that the voters do not easily descend into becoming a mob.
Right.
But we keep removing these speed bumps.
Correct.
Which is not to our benefit. One of these speed bumps is the Electoral College. The Electoral College exists so that you have, again, the various institutions existing in balance against one another. The voice of the people, the voice of the states, the interests of the states, and the interests of the federal government. If all of these things exist and all of these things have a seat at the table, the founding fathers knew, they will each develop their own interests and they will inevitably try to bully the other ones, right? That's just, it can and certainly will happen in some way at some time. So you guard against it and you prepare for it by making sure that the rights of each one of these institutions are clearly specified. The powers of each one are enumerated so they can't start running wild and trampling on these other institutions. But we've really taken the states out of the picture, and you have more of this, it's just direct federal government to citizen. At least that's the narrative that most Americans are actively functioning under, even though most of the laws you're accountable for exist at the state level. The states have just kind of dropped off our radar. Sometimes the states like it that way, I think. There's less accountability and pressure that way. But it's much better if we have all three at the table.
Absolutely.
So the move towards direct election of senators removes the states and the voice of the states, the interest of the states, from the federal government. It's the same kind of impulse that would produce, a different approach to our federal elections that does away with electors and the Electoral College. If you only had the direct election of the people, then the president reflects only the will of the majority.
Correct. And that's what,
rather than a combination, right, of these institutions competing, checking one another, of the states and their electors along with the voice of the people, And remember, back in the day, the founding fathers didn't know that there was going to turn into a two-party system.
So
So
they
there was
all formed
also
against it.
theoretically this role that Congress and the House of Representatives would play in closely contested elections, like Jefferson and Adams when they ran against each other in 1800. I believe Congress, the House of Representatives, had to settle the election.
They did. So House Representatives voted for president, Senate voted for vice president, which again makes sense because the person who's supposed to be running the Senate is the vice president.
Right? He's
That's
the
his job.
president of the Senate.
Right. So each house picked its own person. And again, it shows right relationship, it shows institutional independence. And again, that's striving for that check and balance even within the presidency, within the vice president and the president, the fact that one represents the Senate and the other represents the people in the House is brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. So let's talk a little specifics about electoral college and how it works. So there are 400 or there are 538 members of the electoral college. It's every state's total number of representatives in Congress. So it's your two U.S. senators plus your total number of congressmen. Georgia has 14 congressmen and two senators, obviously. So that's 16 delegates in the Electoral College, 16 electors. And then we have the Washington, D.C. has three Electoral College delegates, even though they have no representatives, which is why all their license plates say taxation without representation. And it's fantastic.
Yeah.
Uh,
Rhode Island's another example of three, I believe.
yes. But they actually have, because they have one member of Congress and two senators, DC gets none of that. They just get three electors, which is I think is helpful. And then Maine and Nebraska are the only two states that do it by congressional seat. So every congressional seat gets one elector, and then the rest of their electors are picked by the majority vote. So
Yeah.
you'll see some splits. Normally, Nebraska always has one that goes blue and the rest go red. And Maine is kind of the reverse. They normally have one that goes red and the rest go blue, but depends on the election.
Right.
So Georgia has 16 because we have 14 members of Congress, two members of the Senate, 14 members of the House of Representatives, two members of the Senate. And then these people are picked by the party system. So they are picked by the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Each of them has their own pool of 16 electors. And then whichever's party candidates, however you say that, whichever candidate wins, the Republican or the Democrat, then get to use the electors that their party has selected. So if the Democrat wins in Georgia, then the slate of electors from the Democratic Party get to go and cast their vote, and then vice versa. So the so it's a misnomer when we talk about popular vote count. There is no popular vote actually being collected. The popular vote is simply all of the news agencies totaling up the total number of votes cast based off what's reported by each state, and then putting that into a report at the end of the night and saying this person won the popular vote. That's not something that was ever required by our Constitution to be recorded, to be measured. It's simply a way that it's just one of the metrics that they look at when they're looking at statistics from the votes. So
Yeah.
the popular vote is meaningless. It's all about the electoral vote, which is why you have to get 270 electoral votes because that's a majority in the electoral college. So
Yeah.
that's
Now,
how
a
it works.
really interesting conversation to have about this, and I don't know if you feel strongly about this, but because you mentioned Nebraska and Maine, there is the question of should a state assign its electors according to the popular vote of the state, right? Or do you go district by district?
Yeah, I think it should be district by district. That would be my. But that's a state level issue. Um, if you went district by district, it would be more democratically represented. It would allow some states like New York, where I used to live. I used to live in upstate New York. It would allow those New Yorkers that are very conservative to actually have a voice in that.
Look how quickly you turn into a populist
I know.
in
It's
2 seconds.
well, our founders left that one up to us. Now, I would say I think there's catches here, right? So I think
Absolutely.
this change would be positive if we could return the Senate to being elected by your state. If we could separate the Senate out again, then to me this change would make more sense. Whereas we can't, I think the current system, especially in Georgia, of all of your electors going to one candidate, is kind of the closest we can get to our state asserting this is what we want as a state,
I like that.
if that makes sense. The same thing is
I like that.
same thing is true about our House of Representatives, right? So the House of Representatives is limited to 435 members. That was done in 1911 under Woodrow Wilson. He expanded it from 399. So at the time, that was seen as a move for democracy, right? We're gonna increase your representation in Congress. I think now we are hindered at the number that we have. There's the goal was to keep it manageable, so that's why they ended at 435. I feel like that's kind of arbitrary. But if you look
Mm,
at our system right now, if you look at the population of the United States in 1911, we're at like 93.8 million people. We are now at 333 million people. And
mm-hmm.
the
Yeah.
amount of people that your elected representatives represent has dramatically increased, right? Which again creates this us and them, and they're unapproachable because, oh, that's my congressman, like I can't go talk to my congressman, like he's a big deal. No, he's not. Like he's there to serve you. Like that's his job
Right.
is to take care of you and be your go-between between yourself, your business, your family, and the federal government, and to keep them off your back and to help you navigate their system when you need to navigate it, right? So
Yes.
I think we need to drastically expand the House of Representatives. But again, this would be paired with a return of the Senate to representing the states, because only then would you have an actual body that would be a check and balance to a mob rule or an overly democracy influenced House of Representatives.
Yeah. My practical concern, if you go district by district, is the the threat of fraud and corruption skyrockets because now you have to do a ton of oversight in every single district, right? Every single district suddenly comes under the microscope. Versus if it's only the aggregate of the state, you can see which state it was close, and then you can throw the microscope over there. Now, ideally, there's never a question about fraud, and this would never be a concern. And like, if we came up with a real silver bullet, like fraud-proof approach to elections that everyone was at peace about, that concern goes away.
Yeah. Well,
The other thing
and that can be, but that
that
can be done. That can be changed on a state by state basis, right? That's a state by state decision on how they cast their electors.
right,
Is my understanding of the law. So,
it is.
so
You have the right to do that.
yeah.
Yeah.
So Georgia has a really solid election law, right? Our election integrity act was really good. A lot of people, a lot of us had some serious questions about 2020 and what actually happened there, and Governor Kemp responded with an excellent bill that makes it extremely hard to cheat, but very easy to vote. And I would have full confidence that if the state board of elections and the states and the Secretary of State's office is doing what it's constitutionally mandated to do to secure these elections and actually hold these groups accountable, with between that and this new law that we have, I would have plenty of confidence that at least from a Georgian perspective, we would be represented well in that. Now, I don't think it's to our advantage to change until a number of other states change. I think it would have to be a kind of a broad consensus piece, right? Because otherwise, you weaken our state as a whole when it comes to the Republican ticket, which is where we are most of the time, right? And 9 times out of 10, now Georgia's a red state. It's not really a purple state. There was some big outliers in the past for some of this stuff. So I think you it's a political calculation as well, right?
It is.
Of how do we want to strengthen our position or weaken our position, which is why I go back and say if we could start by going back to a Senate that's elected by the state house, I would feel much more comfortable about starting to make these changes as well. But you have to restore the institution to its rightful place.
Sure. That's right. Examining the incentives is always interesting. If, because the question is, are the political candidates that want, the votes from this state, are they more likely to spend more time in previously ignored parts of the state?
Yeah.
Like, why would a Republican go and campaign in California? Well, maybe if he was able to carve out some of
Mm-hmm.
those districts
Absolutely.
because he didn't have to worry about winning the whole state, then we would
Correct.
spend a lot more time campaigning in California. But okay, now the negative impact of that as well is that you might end up with this set of incentives where candidates are more likely to spend all of their time in only like a handful of districts that are the most populous or the most populous parts of the country, right? And rather than, I would say maybe the strength of the current system is there's a natural gravitational pull towards the center, ideologically speaking. Because if you're a Democrat, I don't really have to worry about California. If you're a Republican, I don't have to worry too much about Nebraska. But where do I have to worry? And whatever is at the, what do you call that? The median?
Sure.
Whatever's at the median, that's where the competition really exists.
Right.
And so these candidates spend all their time and dump all of their campaigning money into Ohio,
Hmm.
for it seems like my whole lifetime. Or now Wisconsin's becoming that
Sure.
state.
Michigan, Minnesota.
And so every system has its strengths and its
They
weaknesses.
do.
I don't know if there's a silver bullet. I liked your point though about if we got the Senate back to representing the state and then we allowed the electors to represent each district. That'd be interesting. Now, realistically, to your point as well, because of the extent it weakens the state's, prize, as it were, it might be that states determine it's not in their self-interest to divide their political votes. Do the candidates spend a lot of time in Maine and Lincoln, or do those districts also kind of end up getting taken for granted? So it's interesting to think about how these things would change, but however you design it, there's a set of incentives that you create, and you're going to get candidates that respond to it. And sometimes you like it, and sometimes you don't.
Correct. Yep. It's all about the I think the key here the founders were going after is how do we allow people to be involved in their government
Yeah,
directly, but at the same time restrict and restrain mob rule, group thought, and allow freedom and virtue to win.
yeah.
And that often does not happen with the mob, right?
Which is another way of saying that's really well said. The point of it all is not just the will of the people must be done.
Right.
What if the people, are faced with a crazy series of crises and circumstances that really put us in a bad position to make good long-term choices for the country,
Yeah.
right? Not too hard to imagine
Yeah.
stuff like that happening.
What if the will of the people was to be able to kill all of their children whenever they became an inconvenience?
Imagine the people actually making a bad decision once in a while. Okay, not too impossible to imagine. What do you do then? And which is just to say, the point is not just the people getting their way. The point is for justice to be done.
Correct. And at the same time, it requires a virtuous society, right? Because it's also the point is also not to just have a aristocratic oligarchic rule of representation of you don't know anything, you're just a firefighter, or you're just a plumber, or you're a stay-at-home mom, like you don't really have anything to say about this issue, so I'm going to sit up here and I'm going to study and I'm going to read and I'm going to
Right.
decide what's best for you. That's why the genius of the system is that it puts the both of best worlds best of both worlds together, but we've just slowly chipped away at it, and it continues to erode because people are power hungry, and the parties are power hungry, and the parties see these things as the way to get them to a greater position of influence and control.
Yeah. The danger of tribalism is that it just becomes every person in whatever bucket they identify with saying, my bucket of people ought to have their say, right? We ought to have a turn at the levers of power. Versus a very different conversation about, hey, I acknowledge I'm just one of many here, but we're all trying to build something that is a blessing to ourselves and, as the Constitution says, preserves the blessings of liberty to our posterity. So if we're trying to build that together, what does that look like in terms of us building a just and fair society for ourselves and our children? Let's do what is right for everyone involved. It shouldn't ever become a conversation about, well, me and my people, the community that I identify with or represent, it's our turn to make this thing work for us. Like, that's not the question. And hopefully it never descends into that kind of factionalism. The founding fathers in the Federalist Papers put their finger right on the money when they said the greatest threat to this whole experiment is factionalism. The minute we start to identify with a particular tribe, a particular slice of the demographic, that we seek our own interests and our own interests alone, even to the cost, at the expense of another group, another faction in society. The minute that becomes the norm, we all just take it for granted that we all exist in our own tribe, and it's just going to be a war for now to eternity of each tribe against each tribe. America does not work if that is the norm. The more we lean towards democracy, pure democracy, the more we're prone to move in that direction. Like, look at how polarized the country is today. And even if it's just two tribes constantly going at it, the greater problem is that we don't have a shared view of what is fair and right in the country. And so it's almost impossible for us to work together.
Oh yeah, 40%. There was a poll that came out recently that said 40% of voters said they feel unrepresented by these two political parties.
Right.
40%. That is insane.
It is.
It's terrible.
And yet, if you drill into that 40%, it's not like they all agree with each other.
Correct.
Otherwise, you would have a third party
Right.
tomorrow.
Right.
So the country is fragmenting.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to end up with this weird, and I think this is how a lot of people perceive of the system today. You end up with this weird situation where there's two parties that are the dominant parties. Neither one reflects really the majority thought of the country, which is unsettling. But what it needs to communicate above all else is we got a lot of work to do in terms of building culture and community, establishing more common ground. We need to have the hard conversations, right, on the philosophical level. I think the work of, the conversations around the family dinner table is part of that. The conversations that we have at our church and at our civic centers is a big part of that. But then there's also the conversation about how do we compromise given the fact that there are so many unhappy people who feel unrepresented, right? There's so many people out there that, like, we're really on different pages. How do you even begin to build a unified country? And the reason why I ask the question, it's not because I'm saying we have to get better at forsaking our values. That's the opposite of what I think. But the reality is if you have a massively divided country, well, as Lincoln said, and he's just paraphrasing the Old Testament, a house that's divided against itself cannot stand.
Yep.
And the further we go down this road of being a country, and and I'm using air quotes, that nobody's on the same page, there is no shared culture, no shared sense of values. In fact, that's not going to be a country. That's a sham country for now. And the minute a strong gust of wind comes along, it will knock it over. I think this was kind of represented in a poll that came out a few years ago when people were asked, I think it was when Russia invaded Ukraine, and Americans were polled, okay, so if another country invaded America tomorrow, what would your response be? And the majority of, people who were already aged out of military service in the draft, they said, well, I stay and fight. But the majority of people who were fighting age said, I would flee the country. And there was no attachment to the country, no sense of, I've received something here. We are heirs of a great project, a great experiment in liberty, and we're willing to fight to the death to protect this and pass it on to our children. Clearly no sense of that in the American identity of people my age and younger. So if that's the case, like, your country's not going to work very long given the kind of division that we have around us today. So I know that can sound really doom and gloom, but my greater hope through it all is that we would be moved towards one another to have more of the important conversations in recognition of how important it is to be unified, to find the common ground, to pursue the things that are actually true and good and beautiful. And I think, ironically, it's not just that, we need to do that, but that is the only antidote to disunity and division in a country, is gathering around the things that are actually worthy of our uh, shared allegiance,
Right.
right? Truth with a capital T,
Yeah.
righteousness, justice. This is why we started government in the first place. This was the bulwark of the whole American project. So I think they're the things that we can point to is, the reason why this thing has worked so well for so long. And they're the things that we can continue to lean into
Yeah.
that sustain a free people.
Yeah. It's the media and institution conversation that we had in season 2, right? We're
Yes.
disunified as a country because we don't have these things that tie us together anymore. We said, well, we're going to build more garage doors, less porches. We're not going to have a bowling league anymore because everything's online. We're gonna have less meaningful friendships in our lives. We're gonna self segregate from people who think differently than us because that was the brilliant part about the bowling league, right? Was you wanted entertainment, you wanted some competition, you wanted a way to get out with your friends, and this provided the perfect outlet for it. And sure, it would be people that you knew from work, or people that you knew from church, or people that you knew from your kids' school, but even then, you still didn't all think alike, right? You still had some differing views there. Whereas now everybody's on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or whatever, and the algorithms put you with people that think just like you, or that at least express themselves just like you. And so you're in this echo chamber, and there's no value. We said let's not talk politics, let's not talk religion, let's be polite, and we're the worst off for it.
Maybe the pack could host some bowling with Bryce nights.
That would be a lot of fun. Some reinvigorate the media institution. Yeah, we haven't given a shout out to our sponsor yet. That's a great reminder. Huge thank you to Stanford Georgia Values Action and their support of our podcast. You can find more about them on Facebook, Twitter, and on their website, Stanford Georgia Values Action, which we're actually getting ready. I think the website Stanford Georgia Values back. We're actually getting ready to shorten that. That's quite lengthy. It will soon be gavalues.org. That's that's what we should have used to begin with, but we didn't think it was available at the time. So that's what it will be. So depending on when you listen to this, either of those should redirect you to the right place. But
Good.
yeah, this has been really good.
You're right about mediating institutions. Those are the places where people can speak freely and comfortably with one another. And maybe the key ingredient to that is people need to have real relationships
Mm-hmm.
with their neighbors. They need to know the people they're talking to. That gives us a lot more willingness to talk to people, even when we encounter differences of opinion. If I know this guy, I know he cares about me as a friend on a human level. I care about him. I know that we're members of a shared community and we both take that responsibility seriously. That enables us to have harder conversations about areas of disagreement. But I think we'll always be surprised by how much we have in common at the end of the day,
Absolutely.
even with people we disagree with. And if nothing else, there's a shared commitment to doing life together in this community and stewarding this community well. I think you find a lot of fruit there along the way versus people drifting apart from one another, the mediating institutions disappearing, people not knowing their neighbors and reacting to the people that disagree with them ideologically purely in fear and assuming the worst, which seems like so much of the what we call a political discourse
Right, which is
today.
horrible. We can't talk about ideas. We just talk about disagreements, and
Yeah, we try to dig up some crazy quote so that we can blast, our
yeah.
opponent on social media and be done with it.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, it's incredibly frustrating. As opposed to like actually calling out people's records, which makes a lot more sense and is truthful and shows like yeah, I won't dive into that. It's another conversation for another day.
Yep.
But no, this has been really good. So, bottom line, protect your institution. Protect the Republican form of government, right? That's the famous quote that's been making the rounds again, was by Ben Franklin. What kind of government have you given us? A republic if you can keep it. And we tend to be giving parts of it away for no apparent reason. Uh, and there needs to be a restoration of these institutions to their right role. That's why, I, in theory, I want to be pro term limit. Like I think that that could be good, but what did our founders say about it? They said, well, we're not going to deprive the public of the opportunity to continue to reelect a good representative just because we decided that so many years is enough. If we have term limits every 2 years, it's called an election. We got to get out and vote, and we got to make a difference, and we got to do the work of changing hearts and minds. But anyway, we could romanticize about the revival of institutions all day, but at some point you got to get out and do the work. And hopefully, we're doing it. That's
Well, that is at the very heart of this whole American experiment. And right, because it's not about finding the guy and giving him all the power. That's the monarchy approach.
yeah,
The American approach is you create an institution that is limited in scope, enumerated powers, with a specific job description, and whoever is deemed worthy by the people or the electors is placed in that office to do the work assigned to them and to do it well. And even when these institutions butt up against each other, and I loved your point. How'd you put it? Defend your institution.
yes, yeah. Tell everybody else to get out of your lane. This is my
You
lane.
find so much great language in the founding fathers of how do they put it? Basically, it always comes back to this idea of offering manly resistance to those who are encroaching on your sphere,
Yes.
right? On your institution.
Yes.
In other words, hey, don't take it personally that I'm acting in defense of the interests of my office,
Right.
right? My institution and the job entrusted to me. I know that we're going to butt up against each other at times. That's okay. It's not a personal thing. This is how liberty works itself out,
Mhm.
and we both check each other, and we trust that we're both better off for it at the end of the day. Which is why I'm not, even though I go, against you at times, I'm not seeking your destruction.
Right.
I know you're not seeking my
Absolutely.
destruction.
Absolutely.
This is just the nature of the beast, and it's worked out really well. Like, again, for us to ever miss the opportunity to acknowledge how blessed we are to have the privilege of being Americans, to have all the blessings of liberty that we enjoy. If we ever lose sight of that, I think it speaks very poorly of us on many levels, for us to fail to show due gratitude
Oh, absolutely.
to God for all the blessings that we enjoy.
And the resiliency of our form of government, right? The fact that we have come so far from what the founders intended, and we still have not imploded yet by the resiliency of our people and the resiliency
Yeah.
of our institutions, as weakened and misaligned as they are, goes to show the wisdom of this form of government. So all that to
And
say,
the providence of God.
whatever happens in this next presidential election, don't be that guy that says we need to get rid of the electoral college. Don't do it. It's
Or put term limits on our Supreme Court justices.
yes, no,
Or
ugh,
make radical changes just because of a temporary problem
correct.
that we perceive.
What's the
It's
what's the old line? Tradition is answers to questions that we've forgotten.
yes. Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one. So grateful to be an American with you, Bryce. Grateful for everything that God has done in this corner of the world and the story that we are a part of. And I hope that the more we recognize that and the more gratitude we feel in that fact, the more ownership we take in preserving the very best parts of this project, reforming it where it needs to be reformed, purifying it where it is corrupt, et cetera, but safeguarding it in order to pass it forward to our kids so that they may also share in the blessings of liberty.
Absolutely, that's a great way to wrap us up. Thanks for the time today, Spencer, and let's do it again soon.
Thanks, Bryce.
Hey, everybody, this is Bryce Futch, host and creator of the Way Forward podcast, and I wanted to take a minute and tell you about our sponsor for Season 2, Stand for Georgia Values Political Action Committee. They exist to ensure that every vote in Georgia is an informed vote, providing clear, concise, and accurate information about the issues and candidates shaping our future. They do some incredible work finding phenomenal candidates at a local level throughout North Georgia, and then also doing some work across the state as well. But you can find out more information about them at stanfordgeorgiavaluespack.com. We're incredibly grateful to have them as a sponsor. Like I said, not only have they sponsored season 2, but they're going to continue to sponsor the podcast moving forward. So hopefully you'll be getting some more regular content from us. Be on the lookout for that next month. We're very excited for what is to come on the way forward. Full disclosure, I do serve as their executive director of that organization and their partnered 501c3 Stand for Georgia Values Foundation. But thanks again to Stand for Georgia Values PAC for their sponsorship. Please check out their website and be involved with them so that they can continue to support the work that we do here at The Way Forward. Thanks for listening.